All right, welcome into Big Hitters Only, a very special and informative podcast today. We bring on ESPN staff writer Dan Murphy to dive deep into the House settlement and revenue sharing and how it affects UNC basketball, football, and the broader landscape of college basketball. We dive into some NIL stuff, some NCAA stuff, but basically look at the House settlement and revenue sharing, which can get kind of confusing on what it really means. It went into effect on July 1st, and it's have a huge impact on how every major athletic department does business moving forward. So, in a great explainer here from Dan, diving into revenue sharing and the House settlement, how it affects roster building, how it affects football, how it affects basketball, baseball, women's basketball. So, really interesting, engaging conversation with Dan, who works for ESPN, who's one of my good buddies when I lived in Ann Arbor. We've been getting a lot of good feedback on the podcast this summer. We're doing about one a week now. The off-topic stuff, been getting a lot of good interest and buzz. So make sure to go back to listen to Brandon Sharp, a Michelin-winning chef who owns, operates, and cooks at 3 restaurants in Chapel Hill. That was super interesting to me. And then, of course, Tim Buckley, the WFMY lead meteorologist. We had him on a couple weeks ago as well. And then in the middle of that was a podcast, maybe most recently, was a podcast we did with WRL's Brian Murphy that touched on UNC's decision to extend Bubba Cunningham's contract and then bring on Steve Newmark as a new AD in a year. It talks about the transition, what it means, how it positions UNC for a potential conference realignment moving forward, revenue sharing, NIL, and all the moves and the behind-the-scenes stuff the last few years with UNC athletics, and the most recent move of bringing on Steve Newmark as new athletic director is super interesting conversation for UNC fans. So tell your friends about it. Rate, review, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We're growing this thing, and with that comes Delta Spirits. Drink deltaspirits.com. Promo code BHO10 to get 10% off your order. We've been selling a lot of these. It's a great summer drink. If you don't want to drink alcohol, I know I'm moving away from alcohol a lot. It's refreshing. It lightens the mood. It's relaxing. My fiance loves it. So drink deltaspirits.com. Promo code BHO at checkout. BHO10 at checkout. It's a cocktail alcohol substitute with this thing. If you're watching on YouTube. And of course, the basic just cocktail poured over ice. Tons of delicious flavors. Paloma, blueberry lemonade, and I believe we have the cherry limeade, and there's a ginger flavor as well. So drink deltaspirits.com, promo code BHO10 at checkout to get 10% off your order. It helps us support our great people behind the scenes. Shout out Connor and Garrett, who handle the graphics and editing for Big Hitters Only. Here's ESPN's Dan Murphy to dive into revenue sharing and the House settlement and its effect on UNC football, basketball, and the broader landscape of college athletics. All right, now we bring on ESPN staff writer Dan Murphy to dive in deep on the House settlement, its effect on UNC athletics, some general college athletic stuff like conference realignment, money, rev share, and kind of the future of the changing and evolving world of college athletics. Dan focuses on that kind of stuff and has been a specialist on the House settlement for the last, 2 or 3 years. And we welcome Dan now. What's up, man?
Hey, what's going on, Russ? How are you,
It's
man?
good. How long you been covering the House settlement?
Oh man, feels like forever. I've been covering the way that I'd call it like the end of amateurism or like professionalization of college sports since like 2019, 2020 when NIL stuff really started to kick in and the House settlement came, a few months after that real change came across. And so ever since then, I've been keeping track of all this stuff.
And you might notice the casual nature in which Dan and I are interacting. It's because Dan was my best friend in Ann Arbor for 369 days. We hung out. I got connected to him through Tom Loy, who is a coworker at 24/7 Sports, and they both covered Notre Dame together. And we got connected pretty early and hung out a couple times, drank some beers, flowed down the river, watched Michigan win the national championship together right off of Main Street there in Ann Arbor, and Dan was a good buddy of mine there. So let's dive into the house settlement. Explain to us what it is. You don't need to go too far back into the history of it and the whole legal stuff, but like what its effect will be on college athletics, and then we'll get into kind of how it's going to affect teams like UNC.
Yeah, I mean, the major change is that for the first time in the 100 plus years or so of the NCAA and college sports, schools can directly pay their athletes. So starting today, we're taping this July 1, starting today, schools
Mm-hmm.
are putting money directly into the bank accounts of their players for the first time ever. And I think even 4 or 5 years ago, that would have been like totally verboten, unheard of, unthinkable for a lot of people who run college sports. So there are a bunch of other bells and whistles that come along with it that are going to shape sort of the relationship between schools and players moving forward. But it all revolves around money and slowly professionalizing the top end of college sports.
Where are schools getting this money from? Like UNC, for example, or even like a small school like Eastern Michigan or a MAC school or a Sunbelt school. Where is this certain amount of money coming from?
So for top end schools like UNC, there everybody's going to be up to the limit on that cap, if not finding creative ways to get above it. Which is for year one it'll be $20.5 million. It's going to go up a little bit every year after that. So for those schools, it's asking donors for more money. Some people
Okay.
are finding creative ways to generate more revenue. You might start seeing people putting patches on the jerseys or sponsors on the 50-yard line. That kind of stuff all pays pretty big money. Smaller schools like down the road here, Eastern Michigan, they won't be at $20 million. Those kind of schools are maybe be able to scratch together $4 or $5 million or something like that to pay their football and basketball players. But they'll definitely be competing with just a different level of resources, as they have been for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, even in the ACC, I don't think every school is going to opt into the 20.5. So you can just pay as much as you want up to 20.5.
Yeah,
And
that's right. So if you want to pay zero, but if you want to compete, especially, I mean, in football and basketball, right? If you want to compete at the top level, you're going to have to find a way to spend, if not 20, 20.5, really close to 20.5.
yeah, and UNC came out and said they're going to opt into the whole 20.5, and that they are going, like you said, I think I showed you this article maybe last week, a week before. They're going to start doing small patches on jerseys potentially, naming rights to stadiums and fields. Keene Stadium is an easy one because it doesn't have a sponsorship right now. NC State recently, well, they have a corporate sponsorship with Lenovo for their basketball arena, but they have the name on the field for football. But you could see like, I mean, Jordan Brand Keenan Stadium in Chapel Hill or Bojangles Stadium, like those kind of. You got to think big like insurance companies and banks and things could be sponsoring the stadium, the field. What else? More Learfield sponsorships, like different unique ways of Learfield sponsorships on the court at if you see like an NBA, and it happens in college too, but Smith Center, the Dean Smith, the Roy Williams court could now be the Verizon court or whatever. What other ways are teams trying to, or
Yeah,
just
so
trying to
I
get more
think you'll
money?
see you'll find people doing creative things to bring in more money, and then you'll see people starting to spend money differently too, right? You can make more money or you can spend less. Is the two ways to get at it, right? And I think you'll see athletic department staffs shrink a little bit. Having 14 academic advisors and 12 other sort of administrative assistants and all that kind of stuff. I think you could see that start to shrink a little bit. I think the salaries and support staff, especially of your Olympic sports, will probably start to dwindle a little bit as people are cutting costs. And some the big time schools, right, they have 500-600 athletes and they have 250 people on staff in the athletic department because they've had so much extra money to spend over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So I think you'll start to see people cut back and find different ways to save money as well as finding new ways to make money.
Yeah, truly at an inflection point for college athletics. I mean, there's been a couple here with the transfer portal, with NIL, and now with would this be called just house settlement, rev share? How are people going to colloquially call this, casually call
Yeah,
this?
I think we hear, well, the thing I hear most often is the rev share era. If the
Yeah.
last 4 years was the NIL era, this is probably rev share, which is, just another way of saying schools paying their players.
So let's get into how teams will allocate funds, and I think building off that will be scholarships next. Is that the right order to talk about this?
Yeah, however you want to get into it. I mean, it's all
Okay.
sort of it's all connected in a big,
Yeah.
sloppy, confusing mess. But yeah, we can get into it.
Yeah. Okay. So 20.5 UNC is spending in most schools like in Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Michigan. Um, and then a lot of it's going to football. The large percentage is going to football, basketball. UNC mentioned that women's basketball and baseball may get some as well. What are most schools doing? What do you expect UNC to do? How is that breaking down? And then like we'll go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think actually it might be easy to talk about both that and the roster stuff real quick. So you've
Okay.
got this pot of 20.5 million that's coming straight from the school. And essentially think of that as new money that's on top of everything else they were previously giving to athletes, which is scholarships and other kind of benefits, stuff like that. So there are a lot of schools that are adding more scholarships as part of the house settlement. There's no longer a limit on how much every player on your roster can be on scholarship if you want, as opposed to in the past, like the baseball team could only have 11 guys on scholarships or 11
Yep.
total scholarships. And so some of that money for all those new scholarships gets taken out of the $20.5 million pot up to $2.5 million. And the math gets a little wonky. So chop off a couple $1 million for new scholarships for other sports, and you're down to 18-ish or so $1 million that you're going to be doing, that you're going to be giving to players like in paychecks essentially. And most schools, including UNC, are planning on roughly 75% or so of that money going to the football team. So 13, 14, $15 million, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Okay. And so think
Another,
about that there, and then you're paying the quarterback 2 million plus. Your left tackle, your stud, center. You know the important defensive ends. You're paying them 50K, 500K to maybe a
yeah,
million. So you think about all right, they're gonna get would you say 15 million total for football roughly?
yeah, roughly. Yep.
So you're gonna give a good portion of that to a couple players, key positions, quarterback being the main one, and then from there it's gonna be the wide receiver gets this, the running back gets this, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think you'll see, big impact players will all be in the six figures. Certainly key positions at your offensive tackles, defensive ends, cornerbacks, people like that will all be making six figures, depending on how good you are, maybe high six figures. Um, and you know, so yeah, and then it drops off pretty fast. I don't think all 105 guys on the roster are going to be getting a major paycheck. You might all get a few $1,000s toward the bottom end of the roster, but it will, just like it does in the NFL. Like Patrick Mahomes makes, what, 100 times more than the 53rd guy on the roster for the Kansas City Chiefs. And it will look similar in college sports too. Will there be a big difference between the superstars in the locker room versus the guys that are there to be on the bottom of the depth chart?
Yeah, and then I guess like after year one, you're a freshman, you're making maybe you made 50K to sign, and then you're becoming a starter in year two. Then you renegotiate. I'm not sure how that works, but you renegotiate. Now you're all of a sudden you're making 200K as the second receiver for Belichick's offense. Is it going to be like a yearly thing? That's an issue I think needs to be addressed in terms of transferring to and like signing
Yeah.
contracts. You lock them in for two-year deal, 3-year deal. Duke signed a quarterback for 2 years, 8 million. I'm interested to see how that would change. What do you know about kind of how that's going to work out each year?
Right now, schools can do whatever they want. There's no uniform contract or amount of time. Or in the NFL, when you're a rookie and you sign a contract, there's a uniform length of the deal, and a lot of that stuff is negotiated with the players' union. There's no players' union in college sports. All this stuff's brand new. So I think you'll see some schools signing players to 1-year deals because they don't want to get locked in if the player doesn't work out. The downside of that is if the player's great, then you might have to pay him a whole bunch more money down the road, or he's going to get picked off in the transfer portal by somebody else. So I think you'll see a variety of like 1, 2, maybe even 3 or 4 year deals for the really top end players that want to get some guaranteed money. And then over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years, I think schools will figure out what worked well and what didn't. Like all of this is brand new, and people are just going to be throwing stuff against the wall to figure out the best strategy. And eventually there'll be, more and more people will start doing things the same way as they figure out which of these strategies in terms of like building a roster actually works best.
Yeah, and that's why I like the Belichick and Michael Lombardi thing. They're treating it like a professional team. Dan just referenced NFL, and the Chiefs like they're structuring it like an NFL roster where certain players get a certain amount of money. It trickles down from there, and it's a developmental program. So you're trying to bring in people. Maybe I noticed that UNC kind of backed off from recruitment. They're getting a lot of like kind of 3 stars that have potential and not trying to sign the studs as much because I think you can find diamonds in the rough and get them in, pay them a little bit, develop them, pay them more, and kind of build your roster that way, kind of like you build it through the draft rather than trying to get tons of free agents. Transfer portal will certainly still be a huge role, but that's when you can really, it's like free agency. Transfer portal equals free agency. You can go out and make a lot more money. Um, Anything else on football that's kind of come up during your research and your reporting about how this will affect football?
Well, I guess the other thing I'd add there is like while the money coming from the school to the player is going to be, let's call it $14 million or so, the everybody and all the top schools are going to be right at that mark. And the new sort of recruiting arms race or the way that you try to get an edge is through quote unquote legitimate NIL deals.
Yeah.
So while the school is paying the player directly, you can still do deals between the local business and your quarterback or the local business and anybody else on your roster if you want. And there will be, I think, a lot of interesting, let's call it creative gamesmanship on trying to like make those deals seem legitimate, even if they're really mostly to make sure that you're padding your payroll and getting more money to your guys. And the schools that are most aggressive and best at finding ways to, instead of having $14 million, add an extra $5 or $10 million in legitimate NIL deals on top of that. Those are the teams that are going to be recruiting at the top of the. Because right now, teams like Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, their payroll for this coming season for their football team is like $30 million, and that might go down a little bit as time goes on, and whether or not this new kind of the new rules of the House settlement can slow down some of that payment. But inevitably people are going to be spending more than $14 million on their football team, and it's going to be about how can they creatively find NIL deals to help pad the payroll and the salary for a lot of their best players.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what occurred over the last 4 years, like traditional NIL. Armando Baycott, the UNC basketball player, is a great example. Like he was brokering deals with local companies, and even this will happen a lot in college football. Like big time corporations and companies. Let me silence this chat real quick. It's coming through pretty loud. 1 second. Mute. Yeah, so that's how they're going to beef up their salary cap. Now that has to be all above board. It has to be confirmed and regulated, and that's where the gray area comes back in. Where, all right, let's say a car dealership wants to sponsor Drake May, for example, at UNC. Use him as an example. Obviously, plays for the Patriots right now. But they can say, "Hey, come do an ad. We'll pay you $2 million." Now, is an ad really worth $2 million? You're worth what you're worth and what someone's willing to pay you. Explain kind of what the rules are right now for that and how teams will try to circumnavigate that and get back to. I mean, it's not really cheating if someone's willing to pay you $1 million. Bojangles is willing to pay, or not Bojangles, but like a local sandwich shop who has a big donor who's worth a couple million is willing to pay you a lot. How are they going to enforce that, and what's that going to evolve into?
Yeah, so there's this whole brand new organization called the College Sports Commission, CSC, that's now in charge of sort of enforcing a lot of the recruiting rules that the NCAA used to have to enforce. And they oversee kind of both the main buckets, both the money going straight from school to players, as well as all these NIL deals. And this group's goal is to try to stop, what collectives and boosters have been doing for the past 3 or 4 years, where, like you said, maybe they're paying you $1 million to show up one time and sign autographs at the mall or something like that, when really they're just paying you because they want you to show up and play football.
Hmm.
And it remains a really big open question of whether they're going to be able to successfully root that stuff out for the same reasons you just brought up, right? Who's to say exactly what an autograph session is worth? And so this group and the power conferences have actually hired Deloitte, the big time accounting firm, to essentially come up with an algorithm to decide here's a reasonable range of payment for here's what an autograph session you should get for that. Here's what you should get for a local car dealership commercial. Here's what it's okay to get for wearing the apparel of a local, t-shirt shop or something like
Yeah.
that. And they'll review every deal that comes from somebody who is a booster and look at it and say, hey, basically try to apply some kind of algorithm slash common sense to saying, is this really an NIL deal? Or is this actually just a way to try to pay somebody in the way that collectives have been for the past few years? And no one really knows how successful they're going to be at that, or even how aggressive they're going to be at trying to police that stuff. Maybe they're just, is it just the cop who's kind of sleeping by the side of the road to make people think that there's actually somebody enforcing the rules, or are they going to try really hard to pin this stuff down? We don't know yet, and that'll be really interesting to watch here in the next, I don't know, 3 or 4 months as some of these deals start to come through, and whether they get approved or denied will be, I think, have a huge impact on what the future like. There is going to be a next fight, right, for
Yeah.
making it even more professional than it is now, and I think where that fight could play out in a bunch of different ways, and I think that we'll figure out how it's going to play out based on how effective this group is on stopping these third party NIL deals that they want to try to stop.
So we'll basically be like, all right, player X gets this sponsorship from the local chicken shop. He enters that into on a website or whatever, to a file thing, and it goes to Deloitte, and they confirm it or deny it, and then he gets that money.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're a college player, if you're playing UNC basketball, any deal that you get worth $600 or more now,
Mm-hmm.
you have to basically log on to an app that Deloitte has built
Yeah.
and the COC has built, put in the contract, let them look at it, decide yes or no, this is okay or this is not okay. There's a whole process if you want to argue against their ruling, and there's a whole sort of system in place for it now of figuring out whether or not they're going to approve these deals. But yeah, that's essentially the way it's going to work moving forward. And not only is it a big question mark of how aggressively are they actually going to enforce this, but it's also big, like, how often are you going to get college athletes to submit all their deals? And if they
Yeah.
don't, are you going to go after a player? Like, technically that's against the rules not to submit them, but I don't know, how are they going to police all that is going to be really hard.
And what's going to stop? A 5-star recruit comes in on an official visit. Unofficial visit comes in, and he goes, "All right, we're going to take you to this restaurant," and then the restaurant guy drops you a McDonald's bag with $500,000 of cash to say sign with Team X. Like that goes back to the cheating thing. So it's gonna be the Wild West in one way still. It's just a matter of if someone gets caught, what's going to happen and who enforces that. I listened to a little bit of podcast today about that. It's like they have to come down hard on schools, but maybe the school's not even organizing it, But if they're allowing it, maybe that's where they can get in trouble. And like, I think you're gonna have to be pretty strong with penalties if these type of violations are they occur.
Yeah, and that's what this new organization is
Yeah.
in charge for. That's what, so this, they're paid for and hired by the four power conferences, are the folks in charge of this new group. And they, all the conference commissioners, have talked to them all within the past week or so, are like dead set on this thing actually working and having some real teeth behind it. And we asked, started with talking about the House settlement. Like, a big part of what the House settlement does for the schools, they paid a whole bunch of money to make this happen. Why did they pay all that money? Is because they think now that they have the legal backing or the backbone to be able to enforce some of the rules that previously, anytime they tried to enforce one of these rules in the past 4 or 5 years, somebody would sue them. They think that the House settlement gives them some legal cover to be able to enforce these things moving forward. And, we'll see.
Yeah, it's complicated. Okay, so football, we covered that. Scholarship. All right, let's get to scholarships. Well, actually, let's go to basketball. So basketball,
Sure.
roughly 15%, maybe 10% of the total share. Football is getting around 75. This is going to vary for universities. Schools like Duke, UNC, Michigan State may put a little bit more into basketball. And then so that's significantly less because what? 15% of 20 is what?
So it'll be about like $3 million, something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
UNC's roster was 14 million last year. All right. So there's a gap in what they're going to put forward towards basketball and what they need. They're going to need to compete with UConn, Villanova, and every school, Alabama, Tennessee, Duke. They're going to need that $10 to $15 range for the salary. That's what players are going to expect. That's what the 5 stars and the transfers, the top end transfers, are going to expect. So the same thing. They're going to have some money to pay players, but they're going to really have to entice players with the potential for NIL deals, correct?
Yeah, and I think they will try to line those deals up for players in the transfer portal or in the recruiting process because like I just don't see a world in which you can go from a $14 million payroll back down to a $3 or $4 million payroll and still keep people happy and still not have everybody breaking the rules. The money isn't going to shrink by that much, and it's going to get to the players one way or the other. So I think schools are going to find, especially like I mean, basketball is really interesting, right? Because as you brought up, Villanova, UConn, St.
Yeah.
John's, they don't have football teams. So they don't there's no sport by sport limit. If St. John's wants to take $20.5 million and spend every dime on it on their basketball team next year, they can do that. And I just can't imagine UNC and Duke or Michigan or Tennessee being okay. Their basketball staffs, being okay with saying we're just going to have to compete with a quarter of the same payroll that the guys that we're trying to play against have. So one way or another, that's going to change, and I think schools are going to start by trying to find creative NIL money. But I think eventually basketball coaches are going to get fed up with this and say, "Hey, we need a sport specific salary cap or something because this isn't working."
Yeah, well, one thing also on those Big East schools you mentioned, Villanova, like Georgetown, UConn. Well, UConn has football, but they're not in Division Power Four conference. They're not bringing in money from football either. Like Villanova plays football in Division One AA, FCS subdivision, I think. Like they're not making money off football, so they don't have as much money as UNC or Duke.
Yeah, that's true. You don't have the same budget necessarily. Like top end like ACC, SEC, Big Ten schools, the athletic department brings in 100 to $200 million a year, depending on the school. Your Big East schools probably aren't bringing in that much, but if you get a few wealthy donors or you have one big TV contract, they can find money to spend, if not 20 million, like close to it, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
I think those basketball schools will have an advantage, at least to start, on the amount of money that they can dedicate to the men's basketball payroll.
For sure. I mean, yeah, Villanova. I mean, to reach out to the Pope, um, or
Yeah, get some
and they
Vatican
have a
City
lot.
cash in there.
Villanova has a lot of wealthy alums. St. John's has that billionaire, I think, who's kind of been funding their NIL
Yeah,
as
Mike
well.
Rapoli from the guy who started Vitamin Water, right? So yeah, somebody
Yeah,
like that is going to be able to write a check to take care of whatever money they need to take care of.
yeah, it's just so interesting. Okay, so yeah, I think like on recruiting visits, they'll have these NIL deals lined up. Like if you sign with us, look, you can get. We have the rev share. We can pay you some from that, but your deal here is going to be 5 million because we got an extra four coming with a combination between Bojangles, corporations too, Uber, Verizon. We got all these deals lined up for you. You got to put in the time, do the commercials, but over your first year here, you can make 4 million based on NIL. That's how it's going to be sold. So it's also like a marketing thing, like developing these packages, marketing your players, marketing the companies, marketing themselves to the players. It's a big sell and how it's going to change recruiting based on rev share and the new world of rev share NIL.
So
Um,
most big time schools at this point have already basically built a marketing agency inside their athletic department, or they've hired a contractor to be their marketing agency, where their sole job is to go out and find sponsorship deals for the athletes so that when they do show up on campus for a recruiting visit, they can have a package like the one you just described. Like that's if schools are hiring new people, that's one of the main positions they're hiring people to be in the athletic department right now.
is that the collective or is that different than the collective? Or is that through the
In some
collective?
places, yeah, in some places, essentially the school just took the collective and hired that group to start working directly for the school and working for them. In other places, they've structured it a little bit differently. But yeah, in many cases, what the collective has set up has just sort of been consumed by the school and is now a part of the athletic department.
Awesome. I want to quickly talk about our sponsor, drinkdeltaspirits.com. A cannabis spirit cocktail here, Dan. We got blueberry lemonade, 10 milligrams in the blueberry lemonade. It's a local Greensboro, Kernersville company. Drinkdeltaspirits.com. It's a great, refreshing cannabis THC based cocktail. Put over some ice, split it with your partner. It's an alcohol substitute. It works. It makes you feel good. It makes you have the giggles after a hard day of work. DrinkDeltaSpirits.com, promo code BHO10 if you're trying to move away from alcohol, don't want to deal with the hangover, just want something light and refreshing after work on a weekday, drink deltaspirits.com, promo code BHO to get 10% off your order. And here's kind of like the liquor substitute. You just make a cocktail instead of using vodka or gin, Dan. You use this as the shot, a shot of vodka, a shot of gin. Drink deltaspirits.com, promo code BHO. Your support and buying this stuff helps us pay our producers. Shout out Connor and Garrett behind the scenes helping these episodes get out. If you like the content, we're dropping about one episode a week now this summer. Support us by supporting drinkdeltaspirits.com, promo code BHO. All right, let's get into scholarships. So this is interesting because I think every school is doing it differently. I was trying to read up on UNC's. UNC is they're increasing their scholarship allotment by 200 across 28 sports. So it's going from 338, which was what they had last year and the years before that, where you had, I think it was like 13 for basketball, 11 point something for baseball, 85 for football, so-and-so for swimming, so-and-so for wrestling, so-and-so for women's basketball. It's now going from 338 total scholarships to 532. I don't know the exact distribution, but that is the same throughout athletics, right? Now football, you can only have this many scholarships. The roster limit or the scholarship limit, can you kind of explain that whole? I'm a little confused as to what the rules really are now.
Yeah, so this is again a part of the House settlement. So the main, like real quick, the legal argument behind all of this is that any rule that potentially limits the earning power of an athlete, schools can't all get together and decide on a rule like that without violating federal antitrust law. So they tried to anticipate other ways that schools might be violating that law. And one of them was previously the NCAA had limits on the number of scholarships you could give out, which is a limit on how much money an athlete could be compensated with. And
Right.
so, yeah, so, it used to be, let's use baseball, might be the best example, right? It used to be that on your 35 or 40 player baseball roster, you could only spread out 11 full scholarships. And so a bunch of guys would be on half scholarships, and you have one or two players that were on a full ride. Moving forward, they've put in, instead of having a limit on how many scholarships you can have, there's now a hard limit on how many players you can carry on your roster. But every player who's on the roster can be on a full ride scholarship if you want. You don't have to, right? You can split up money or spend whatever money on scholarships, however you choose to divide that up. But if you want, you can put every single athlete on every team on your campus on a full ride scholarship moving forward. And so like UNC is like that's a really high number, right? They're clearly committing to spending a bunch of money on their non football and basketball sports. Then there are other schools that are doing similar stuff, but that's not everybody's committing that amount of money to be successful in field hockey and lacrosse and swimming and all those other sports that UNC is throwing money toward.
So what's the football roster limit now?
So football rosters 105 max.
Okay, across
Players
all
on the
athletics,
roster.
across all teams in college football.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, that's up from 85. So UNC can have 105 scholarships, 105 players on the team, and also 105 scholarships. So that can really increase your depth. You're now instead of having 20 walk-ons to get, you have 85 really good players and 20 walk-ons, you can have 105 scholarship players and really increase you would think your depth on a team. Is that kind of the way to think about it?
Yeah. So again, there's a bunch of different strategies, right? So you might have somebody who wants to put 105 guys on scholarships on the football team. But again, that costs money, right? And now money is a little bit tighter for a lot of these places. And is the 95th guy on your football roster really adding that much value?
Yeah.
So let's say a scholarship costs like $50,000 for an in-state. Like that's how much it's going to cost the school to have the 95th, the fifth string linebacker or something like that. Would it be smarter to take that $50,000 and add it to your offensive tackle salary that he's getting instead of spending it on the scholarship? Because that guy's actually going to be on the field and you can get a slightly better player if you spend more money. So we've seen plenty of football teams that are actually sticking with 85 scholarships. They'll keep 20 guys that are just walk-ons and see if they develop into somebody that they want to give a full ride to later. And instead, there's like all those new scholarships are going toward their other sports where you're not going to like if you're not on the football, the basketball, or maybe the baseball team, you're probably not getting like a revenue share paycheck kind of money, but you might be getting a scholarship where you wouldn't have previously. Like the North Carolina women's soccer team, one of if not the best soccer programs in the country, they're probably not going to get any rev share money, but now they will probably have every single player on the roster is going to be on a full scholarship, where it was before NCAA rules prevented them from doing that.
So, so if UNC does 105, they have to have 105 roster spots.
That's the most they can have. You can have less than that if you want, but you can't have
Yeah,
more than 105 guys on a football team.
and all 105 have to be on scholarship.
No, no, you can nobody
Oh,
you can
okay,
do zero if you want. Yeah, you just can't do more than that. You don't have to
okay.
put everybody on scholarship. You can if you want.
Oh, okay. That's more clear. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like even like just give 60 scholarships out. Like I mean, I don't know, like 80. Like you don't need like those five players. If you go 80, like those 85 players don't. That's a lot of money you could give to, like you said, the quarterback, left tackle, backup quarterback, or a good wide receiver or running back. So it's really changing the strategy of how you build a roster, and you really have to evaluate well, and then kind of decide how you're going to use your money each year. What else have you heard about how people are doing it? Is there like other techniques and strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll see how the transfer portal is affected by all this and whether players are transferring less. But I think you see a lot of schools, especially at the top levels of football, saying, "Listen, I don't want to necessarily go sign 25 incoming freshmen. I'm going to let those guys go play at an FCS school or a group of five school for a year or two, get in the weight room, develop. I'll figure out which ones are good, and then I'll just go pick them up in the transfer portal." Where these smaller schools are almost becoming like potentially becoming sort of like minor league teams where UNC and Belichick can just go scout a group of five school, find guys that have proven themselves a little bit better on the college level, and recruit them out of the transfer portal rather than recruiting kids out of high school. So I think you'll see more and more of that too moving forward, where
So
as long as the transfer portal stays open.
in that way, you're not wasting money on a freshman, paying
Yeah, it's less
him,
risky.
paying him 100K, and he doesn't do anything for you. You wait a year, let him go somewhere else, and then if he's good enough, pick him up in a year and then pay him. So you're getting kids a little older. I mean, that's kind of been the trend for the basketball for transfer portal. Like it's better to have a player going to his third or fourth year than a freshman because they are developed, like you said. So I'm sure it works for football as well. That's so interesting. That like changes the game, and there's so many different ways you can build your roster out. When you add the money aspect as well, it kind of flips roster building. Recruiting is going to be impacted as well, like you said. And you add in the transfer portal element. It's a lot of moving parts to build out an 85 person roster, 105 person roster, or basketball, which is going to be 15, right?
Yep. Yep.
So anything else on basketball? So 15, you have 15 roster spots, 15 scholarships. You got to think UNC is going 15 scholarships, or at least trying to get to that number, and then filling out the roster. They can't get 15 studs. They're going to bring in two or three walk-ons that probably played in high school and put them on scholarship to get, because you need 15 players to practice essentially. Is there anything else on the basketball aspect you've been hearing?
No, I think that's the what we talked about, sort of the difference between the Big East schools and some of these other schools. Basketball, transfer portal is going to work the way it's been working. Yeah, I think we covered most of the interesting stuff there.
The impact of basketball. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. What else is there? I'm taking my notes here. Anything else you want to touch on with NIL, with rev share? Let's talk about the future of it. Like, where could this go? Um, what's going to be the implications of this rule? It's going to be challenged in multiple ways, like you mentioned. What's going to happen in the near future, and even looking ahead to like 5, 10 years?
Yeah, so I think right, like over the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, maybe there's been all these lawsuits and legal fights as we slowly crept from amateurism into what is now like pretty much full-blown professional sports at the top level. And I don't think we've reached the end of that by any means yet. And I think the next fight is really over whether athletes are employees or not. And the big question that comes along with are you an employee is can you unionize and collectively bargain for more money? And I think one way or another, like we're going to get to a point, whether it's a couple of years down the road, 5 years down the road, where at the very top edge of college sports, athletes have something that looks like a union or a players association that can sign a collective bargaining agreement with the schools on a regular basis that negotiates how big the salary cap and all these other things are going to be moving forward.
That's kind of if they become. Would that make them like employees of the university? Is that what collective bargaining means?
Yeah, so in order for a collective bargaining agreement to like hold up legally, you have to be part of a formal union. And in order to be part
Okay.
of a union, you have to be an employee. And which is hard, right? Because if you're a state, if you work for a public university in the state, there are some states where you aren't allowed to unionize as a public employee, right? So it gets really
Yeah.
complicated and hard to figure out with the legal aspect of all of it. So there are potentially other ways around it where maybe there's a new, like, people are asking Congress to basically write a new law. Um, and one solution is to say, let's let college athletes collectively bargain in a way that holds up legally without actually making them employees. Maybe there's some like middle ground there between schools really don't want their players to become employees for a bunch of different reasons, right? Then there's more cost associated with that. They just don't like the idea of students being employees. It's hard to know. Like, it would make sense, I think, to consider Drake May an employee of UNC, right? But like making the fourth rower on the men's rowing team at UNC, if they have a rowing team, is more a student than he would ever be an employee. And so, like, where do you
Yeah.
draw that line between your athletes? It gets really hairy really fast. And so, I think there are a lot of people trying to figure out the right solution to get there eventually. But I do think we're going to get to a point where at least football and probably basketball, or at least football and men's basketball, maybe women's basketball, look a lot more like employees of their school at some point here in the next few years.
So how do you collectively bargain without being employees?
Uh, it's a good question. So you'd have to get some kind of like, basically you'd have to form a players association, and
Okay.
there's all kinds of questions about how you do that, right? Was it you go by conference, you go by sport? What's the size of your association? Um, and you'd have to get something from Congress that allows you to do, basically creates a special category of worker that says you can collectively bargain even if you don't have all the rights of an employee.
Yeah. Such legal. There's so much legal aspects of this. I feel like you've gone through law school probably reporting on this.
Man, I talk to more lawyers and politicians than I do coaches and athletes these days. It's really interesting, but yeah, it's hard. It's funny. You can like talk about it on a real high surface level, or you can get really deep into the weeds really fast, and it's hard to thread the needle in between those two things.
It's like a great time to go to law school and be an NCAA sports
Oh
admin
man.
specialist because all these schools are hiring lawyers for this. So are the organizations like NCAA and the CSC. And then players are probably hiring some sort of legal representation at some point to sue to figure out different ways to make money.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean the
yeah.
guys the lawyers that were in charge of this house case are probably going to walk away with a $500 million in legal fees from the 4 or 5 years that they did this. So it's a pretty good time to be a sports lawyer. Yeah, no doubt.
On both sides of it, right? On both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. NCAA. What's going to happen with NCAA? Because now they're giving their power away to the CSC to regulate all this rev share and NIL stuff. I mean, they've been under fire for the last 10 years for a variety of reasons. What do they do now other than run the tournaments?
I think that's it. And that's not nothing, right? Like, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're totally useless. Like, the basketball tournament is still a huge deal, a totally uniquely American thing that will get preserved and is important. They run all of the other sports championships other than football, which is, a lot of work and a lot of organization. And you need some type of national organization. If you want to have a national champion, you have to have a national organization that makes the rules for, like, while the CSC will be in charge of all the rules that govern recruiting and paying athletes and all that kind of stuff, the actual like on the field rules of, do we have 2 minute warnings? Do we have quarters versus halves in college basketball? All that kind of stuff. The NCAA will still have committees and groups that make all those rules that actually impact the games on the field. But their role in policing recruiting and all that stuff is very significantly changing and shrinking moving forward. So yeah, which I think honestly like they're pretty happy to say you guys and the power, like most of these problems that they've had to pay, like we just talked about, hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees over the past 10 to 20 years, are problems created by the big time power conference schools. And the NCAA represents 1,000 schools from D3 on all the way up to the very top of the heap. And so I think they're happy to say, let's let the rich schools handle the rich school problems. We will no longer be the lead defendant in the next set of lawsuits that inevitably is going to come. And that's your problem to handle now. We're going to stop paying your legal bills for it.
The big school thing begs another question we briefly talked about on the phone today about conference realignment, where it's going. So right now, obviously, there's four power conferences in football, five in basketball. There's two main. I mean, it's very clear. There's two main conferences for college football that make the most money. It's the SEC and the Big Ten. They dominate. They win the championships. They have the most money. They have the most enrollment for undergrads. They're just bigger and better schools compared to the Big 12 and the ACC. Now, the Big 12, has Kansas in basketball, and UNC and Duke for the ACC and basketball. There are exceptions, but I think the rich are getting richer in the SEC. The SEC has become the better basketball conference, and same with the Big Ten to some respects. Where do you see conference realignment going now, as schools position themselves for the next era of realignment? Do you expect anything relatively soon? I know ACC has the 2036.
The grant of
What's that
rights.
called again?
Yeah.
Grant of rights. Yeah, I feel like that was so long ago. That was really like a year or two ago. So what do you
So
kind of
what
expect?
happens? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Let's have a little fun with this conversation and kind of what
Yeah.
you expect over the next 5, 10, 20 years with conference realignment.
Yeah, so there's one scenario I don't know, right? Is the
Yeah.
obvious cop out answer, but like the one interesting scenario that I could see playing out that I think is the one worth getting into is look, obviously football drives a bus on all of this, right? And TV contracts drive the bus on football, and that's the overwhelming amount of money. And money's what drives all of these decisions.
Hmm.
And so, especially as teams are paying players directly, money becomes a more important and direct, uh, you know, determiner of whether you're going to succeed on the field or not. The gap between so there's 65, 70 power conference football programs right now. The gap between the top 10 or 15 of those in terms of budget, the money that they can spend, and even the bottom chunk of the power conferences is huge, right? Like Alabama's football budget is 3 times the size of what West Virginia and Oregon State and Wake Forest and any of those schools are able to spend on football. And so the idea that Alabama, and so if you have these new limits that are essentially a salary cap, right? They're designed so that schools like West Virginia and Purdue and Boston College have a fighting chance of spending somewhat near the same amount of money that Ohio State and Alabama are going to spend. And so one of two things is going to happen. Either Alabama and Ohio State are going to find creative ways around the rules to spend 3 times as much as those schools do, and they're going to blow them out of the water, or Alabama and Ohio State are going to have to be limited in the amount of money they spend, and they're going to get really frustrated with all that and want to find a way out. So I think eventually that leads to whether it's 30 or 40 or whatever the number is, some smaller number of schools that's at the very top end and in a different tax bracket of what they can spend, getting frustrated with the current system and saying we're worth more if we just play each other when all
Uh-huh.
these TV contracts come up, when the grant of rights ends in the next 5 to 10 years. Let's get the best 30 or 40 biggest draws for TV ratings and the national brands together and create sort of the college sports super league. Um, and it feels like it's inevitably pushing toward that, right? If the free market has its way, at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have the top 30 or so schools that split away and say, Illinois, Wake Forest, Rutgers, whoever, you guys are sort of Boston College. You guys are dead weight slowing us down, right? Our TV deal isn't any bigger because you're here and you're still getting a big chunk of it. That's not fair. We can make more money if we just cut you and get rid of you. And you have to be a big time football team to be part of that conversation, which I think is why you see UNC hiring Bill Belichick, which is why you see Duke spending $8 million on a quarterback, because they know that to be part of the next the next step of college sports, you've got to be there in football too, even if you want to just hang in basketball.
You,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's where it's headed.
you've got to prove your value. You've got to recognize that you bring in TV eyes. Um, that's going to be the determining factor. Um, so would that be a breakaway from the NCAA, or has that already happened with the college football playoff?
Yeah, it's a good call. Like it's they've kind of like dipped one foot in that water. And
Yeah,
this is happening even more with like the CSC and the way that these new rules are going to be enforced, right? That's no longer under the like more and more the power conference schools are splitting off to be their own little fiefdom. And right now it's still under the NCAA's umbrella, but it's less and less controlled by the NCAA with each kind of passing iteration of this. And so especially if they get to a point where they want to make these guys into employees. The question is, do those guys who want to play what will then essentially be professional sports split off into some league that's totally their own outside of the NCAA's control? And then the NCAA can just be in charge of sort of like what we thought college sports was 30 years ago.
yeah.
It feels more amateur.
And you hear this a lot whenever Greg Sankey talks about like what the SEC is doing. It's like they're operating their own thing. They are calling the shots, and it's like kind of scary for the smaller schools. Like who's going to be left out? But I do think it just there's no reason why Boston College should be competing with Alabama and Texas. Like Wake Forest should not be competing with Auburn and Georgia. Like there is, it's such a difference in the amount of money. Now this rev share thing is supposed to close that gap on the payroll on how much they can spend. Will it really do that? I mean, I think the best players will still go to the SEC schools because there's going to be some under the table stuff, and they're gonna have better facilities. They're gonna have better trainers, better weight rooms, better. You're gonna play in front of more fans, so there's gonna be still the desire to go to the bigger schools. So there's no reason why Wake Forest, Boston College, even some of the smaller public schools should even compete with these power schools in the Big Ten and the SEC. So it just seems like, yeah, there should be like different divisions. Like there should be the big dog division, SEC, Big Ten schools, whoever can join from the SEC and the Big 12, and then like a lesser division that's like it's not the FCS, but it's maybe Duke football or Boston College football, Wake Forest, Baylor. I'm trying to think of smaller schools like Stanford and Cal. Like they should not be trying to compete with Alabama and Texas.
Well, that's the question that I think is the most interesting thing here in the next, we'll call it 5 or 10 years, is like you're going to separate it. So you got like the kids table and the adults table, right? Moving forward in those divisions, and like who makes the cut to the adults table? Because inevitably there's going to be a handful of teams that are on the bubble, and I don't know exactly where that bubble exists. Like, is Syracuse going to be able to play big time college sports in the future? Is you can draw that line wherever you want, but like there will be schools that are sort of on that bubble in the next 5 to 10 years that are scrapping and spending as much money as they can possibly spend and taking out loans and taking money
Mm-hmm.
from private equity firms to be able to compete and bring in top level recruits one way or another so that if and when this big split between the two groups actually happens, that they get the invite to the big dogs table. And I think there's going to be a pretty ruthless fight to make sure that you make the cut over the next 5 or 10 years if you're on one of those schools that's on the bubble.
I think relegation would be awesome too. There's gonna be such a divide; it'd be tough. But like, I mean, yeah, I think like let's say West Virginia, for example, like they get left out, but they increase their enrollment. They have a new facility, and then they have one big season, and they get relegated up or moved up to the big dog league. It's just kind of a fun thing. You get kicked off. You get kicked off if you suck one year, and you're constantly fighting to get back in or get out. I think that would be. I don't think it ever would happen, but never say never. I think that's a really cool way to think about it in college athletics. I don't think it'd work in the NBA or NFL, but I think there's an opportunity because there's more schools and more schools that have the same amount of money for that to work.
Yeah, love that idea. There's a couple groups out there that have pitched something kind of similar to that. Basically, like their thought is, let's pretend we're starting from a blank sheet of paper and rethink the way college sports is structured. And if we do that, can we set up a few tiers and then make it possible to jump from one tier to the next? Like depending on how good you are on the field in any given year or couple of years. And like, it works in English soccer. there are
Hmm.
reasons that make it difficult and people don't want to do it because it's hard to play in your budget if you're jumping from one league to the next from year to year. But like, it would be a lot of fun and make for a lot of really fun, interesting games if you're on the spot to potentially get relegated from one year to the next.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like you said, like SEC, UNC is positioning themselves to be invited to that big table when it does happen, whether that's a move in 5 years to the SEC or in 10 years when the grant right's over. Like with the Belichick stuff, with the funding behind it, the hiring. We're recording this on Tuesday, July 1st. UNC just announced the move to, let me pull up my Twitter because his name is Newmark as the new athletic
Steve Newmark,
director.
yeah.
Yeah, Steve Newmark, who's going to succeed Bubba Cunningham in a year. They're positioning themselves through revenue and getting more into the business aspects of athletics to make that move and to be ready when that time comes to be able to compete with Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, to have the money ready to go to build better facilities, to increase enrollment, all that stuff too. I think UNC, for example, needs to really increase enrollment. They need to start graduating more alums. I mean, it's right now they have 18, 19,000 undergrads. I mean, some of these Big Ten schools have like 50,000 undergrads
Yep.
per year. So the alumni base is just so different.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they're hiring somebody who's coming from the professional sports world to take over for Bubba Cunningham at AD, the fact that they've hired Bill Belichick and Mike Lombardi to create a virtual professional football program on campus, like none of that's a coincidence, right? That's because of what we just talked about, wanting to make sure that if and when things split 5 or 10 years from now, UNC wants to be part of the big
Yeah.
dogs table, right? Like that's not they're big hitters. Uh, but a little plug for you.
There you go.
Yeah, I think they and that's college sports is huge business. Like higher education in general is on sketchy ground right now of enrollment and whether or not schools are, some schools are going to be able to survive some of that as populations drop and all kinds of other problems with the huge business model of colleges. And college sports are their biggest marketing tool. And so I think a lot of like university presidents and boards of regents and all those people take this stuff really seriously now because they know that they need to have a big time sports program to be the big brand name university that they want to be.
Yeah, I mean, alums aren't donating if the team is losing and they're playing shitty games. Like you get a big donor, he's worth 500 million. He's going to give your university 10 million for athletics, but then maybe 20 million to the business department or the to build a new building on campus that helps academics. Like there is a lot of advantages to being big time in athletics that will also help the academic side of things at universities. All right, I mean we could talk. There's tons of different directions we could go, but let's end it there. But I do want to ask you a couple questions from your career. You're a staff writer for ESPN. Been there for how long? You been at ESPN now?
10 years,
10 years. What are some of the
long
biggest
time.
things you've covered? The biggest topics because you have a kind of a unique job in that you're not day to day in terms of just writing breaking news. You're covering bigger idea stories.
Yeah, so when I first started there, my job was to cover Big Ten football, and I moved to Michigan right as Jim Harbaugh was hired. So I covered the Jim Harbaugh era and all the craziness that went along with that. And then I moved from kind of covering just college football into what our investigative reporting team when the USA Gymnastics and Larry Nassar scandal happened here in Michigan, and I covered that for a year or two, and that was a life changing and career changing experience and story for me, and I like kind of like reshaped a lot of the stuff that I do into being more intersection of the legal world and the sports world. So since then I've covered some abuse cases, a bunch of these kind of like college lawsuits, a handful of other topics where sports kind of intersect with other parts of major issues going on in society. So it's a really cool, interesting job where I get to sort of dip my toe into a lot of different areas to try to learn about them.
Yeah, but you're not dipping your toe. Like you're diving deep into
Fair. Yeah. Yeah.
broad,
Yeah.
broad topics and very impactful stuff. Is there anything else you're kind of focused? I know the house settlements and NIL and transfer portals taken a large amount of your time the last couple of years, but what are some other things like right now in 2025 that you've been working on?
The most fun one, right? I wrote a story about it about a month ago. I'm certainly going to do some more reporting on it and writing on it as we go forward. Is there's a new competition called the Enhanced Games. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
I'm
basically
sorry.
like a version of some Olympic events where you can take a lot of the banned substances and steroids that you couldn't otherwise take if you wanted to compete in the Olympics. I think it's like, and it's backed by these kind of like billionaire pharmaceutical guys that want to live to their 150 years old. And it's a really wild, interesting topic of, what does the future of sports look like? Are we going to get into the point where we're more comfortable taking all kinds of supplements and seeing how fast we can go? So I've spent a bunch of time recently with a couple of swimmers who are now on sort of different stacks of PEDs to try to get as fast as they possibly can. And there's a lot of money in it, and there's a lot of like interesting
That's crazy.
characters. So that one's pretty fun.
So that's not college related at all.
Nothing college, yeah, yeah, totally different
That's
subject, yeah.
that's unusual for you, right? Aren't you
Yeah,
mostly always
college has
college?
been there's just so much weird stuff going on in college that since
Yeah.
I've developed some expertise here, that's where I spend most of my time. But it's fun to be able to do some stuff outside of it too.
Give us a hardball story. You've told me a couple because I love hardball. So when we were hanging out last year in Ann Arbor, you definitely told me some stories. Give us a tidbit, anything that is worthy for our listeners.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say like he's an interesting guy to cover from a reporter's perspective because he's not gonna play any games. Like he is exactly who he comes off. Like he is who he's a very authentic guy, and I actually like and respect that about him after having spent 5 to 10 years around him here in Ann Arbor. I remember early on, like a year or two into covering Michigan, they had some event where his wife was there, and she started describing about how like she would occasionally come home and see him hanging out in the driveway, like having pulled in from a full day in the office, sitting in the driver's seat in the car, still in the driveway, like just staring blankly straight ahead. And she'd come out, and knock on the window, and he'd be like, "Oh, hey, sorry, I was like watching film in my head for the past 30 minutes, sitting in the drive." Like he is just so locked in on football all the time that she was like, "Yeah, I know you guys get that 1,000 yard stare sometime from him when you ask him questions. Like, trust me, I get the same thing at home. Like, he is who he is, and he's a really interesting character. Dude's a genius and obsessed with football. In every walk of life.
That's awesome. All right, man. Well, I appreciate your time, guys. Follow Dan on Twitter, Dan Murphy. What's your actual Twitter? Dan Murphy, ESPN. Um,
I gotta have
and
my Twitter
remember,
game. I know you're on me on that.
yeah, I turn on your alerts, so I do see when you tweet. Dan's not super active, but he does share his stories when he does write them. DrinkDeltaSpirits.com. Guys, check that out. Promo code BHO10 at checkout. DrinkDeltaSpirits.com. Dan, we appreciate your time, and maybe we'll have you on in a couple years when there's more development, or maybe a little earlier than that when there's big news surrounding the House settlement, transfer portal, NIL, and the big issues of college football.